When I saw my husband standing in the hallway, holding my journal with both hands like it might shatter, my heart skipped a beat, not from fear of being caught, but from knowing exactly what he was reading. The pages were open to the part one had foolishly forgotten to rip out, the part one swore I would burn but never did. He wasn't supposed to find it. That notebook had been buried deep under scarves in the closet, behind old boxes, untouched for months. And yet there he stood, flipping page after page, his eyes widening, his mouth tightening. I could hear my own pulse echoing in my ears. He glanced up once, just once, and the look he gave me wasn't anger. It was devastation. And somehow, that was worse. I stepped forward instinctively, wanting to explain, to defend, to erase the words with my voice, but my feet wouldn't move. The journal trembled slightly in his grip as he kept reading. I knew the sentence he was approaching. The one that changed everything. The one that said, in no uncertain terms, what had happened between me and his father. His hands clenched tighter around the spine of the book, and I could almost feel the sound of the paper tearing. And then the doorbell rang. We both froze. I didn't have to look to know who it was, I recognized the timing. I recognized the pattern. Because this was the moment I'd been dreading since the day it all began. Let me tell you how it started. Let me take you back to the moment everything shifted. But before I share the secret I tried so hard to bury, write in the comments what city you're watching this from, and answer me this: have you ever had a secret you fought to keep, only to have it destroy everything anyway? I used to believe that silence in marriage meant peace. That if we weren't arguing, then things were fine. That if the dinner plates clinked softly against the cutlery and the television filled the background, it meant we were still functioning. Still something. But over the last few years, that silence began to rot. It wasn't peaceful, it was vacant. Hollow. Like living inside a museum where no one was allowed to touch anything anymore. He started sleeping in the guest room almost 2 years ago. There was no fight that led to it, no dramatic falling out. Just a slow, mutual drift. He said it was his back. The mattress in the master bedroom was too soft. I offered to replace it. He never followed up. I stopped asking after the 3rd time. I suppose I already knew the answer. We still went through the motions. Meals, laundry, conversations about bills and appointments. We even shared the same space in the mornings, drinking coffee like polite roommates. But that was it. Touch had vanished from our vocabulary. I couldn't remember the last time he kissed me, not out of habit, but with meaning. Not since the funeral. His mother's passing had affected him deeply. And strangely, it was his father who came to us for help. A strong man, quiet, never the emotional type. After the funeral, he asked if he could stay with us for a while, just until he figured out what came next. He brought one suitcase and a wooden cane that he hardly used but kept near at all times. At first, I welcomed the distraction. It gave our house a new rhythm, a new voice, someone else to hear at the dinner table. And in the quiet moments when my husband buried himself in work emails, his father would ask me questions. Simple ones, about the garden, about dinner, about my day. But even those felt like a shock to my system. Someone was paying attention. Someone was listening. One evening, after dinner, my husband said he had a late meeting and wouldn't be home until well past midnight. It was raining outside. I was cleaning up the dishes when his father offered to help dry. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, like he was trying to savor the task. We didn't talk much, but the air between us felt gentle. I hope you're not too tired, he said softly, drawing a plate I handed him. You seem exhausted lately. I almost laughed. No one had said that to me in years. I nodded, murmured something vague about poor sleep. He didn't press. But he looked at me in a way that made me wonder if he saw more than he let on. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room long after midnight, staring at the dim glow from the garden lights outside. I didn't hear him come in until he was already standing near the hallway. He didn't say anything, just stood there in silence for a moment, then turned and walked back to his room. The next morning, the house was quiet again. My husband had already left for work. His father was sitting outside on the porch, reading the paper. I brought him tea without asking if he wanted any. He smiled, a grateful smile. That moment shouldn't have meant anything, but it did. It was a transaction of warmth I hadn't experienced in far too long. Later that day, I went into my closet to find a sweater and came across an old box of photos. I sat down on the floor and began sorting through them, looking for something I couldn't name. There were pictures from our wedding, our son's first birthday, beach vacations. In every photo, I looked content. Not radiant, but settled. I realized I hadn't felt that version of myself in years. My husband called that evening from work to say he'd be out of town for a few days, unexpected business. I said, okay, and he hung up before I could say more. I stared at the phone for a long time afterward, not knowing what I had wanted to say anyway. That night, as I watered the plants by the kitchen window, I saw his father outside, standing near the tree swing that had once been our son's favorite spot. He looked lost in thought. When he came back inside, he didn't speak much. Just nodded to me, then poured himself a glass of water and retreated to his room. There was nothing about any of this that felt dangerous. Not yet. But I was aware of something shifting, something subtle. Like the moment before a storm, when the air feels thick and the sky hasn't yet decided whether to break open or hold still. And somewhere inside, I felt the pull. A gravitational shift towards something I hadn't let myself want in a long, long time, to be noticed. To be seen not as someone's wife, or someone's mother, but as myself. I didn't know where any of this was going. I still don't know if I wanted it to go anywhere. But it had started. Quietly. Slowly. And I wasn't sure I could stop it, even if I tried. The next morning began like all the others. Routine was a kind of armor, I suppose. I went through the motions, slippers on, kettle boiling, toast in the toaster. The floor felt cold under my feet, and my robe didn't seem to hold warmth the way it used to. I moved through the kitchen like a ghost occupying a life she used to own, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator as if it might offer some sort of conversation. My husband had already left. He hadn't even said goodbye this time. There was a note by the coffee pot that read, "Meeting downtown. Might be late. No love, no see you tonight, just that." 7 bland words that somehow managed to sting. I sat at the table, cradling my mug, staring through the window at the backyard. The swing hung still from the old oak, unmoving in the morning breeze. I remembered how, years ago, I used to push our son on that swing, how his laughter echoed into the trees. The silence now felt like a rebuke. His father joined me a few minutes later. He always waited until I was settled before entering the room, like he respected the bubble I lived in each morning. Today, though, there was something different in his presence. He moved slowly, not because of age or pain, but like he was trying not to disturb something fragile. "Did you sleep?" he asked quietly as he poured himself a glass of water. I nodded. A lie, but a convenient one. The truth was I hadn't slept much at all. The kiss, the moment, looped through my mind like a broken record. I didn't know what it meant, or what it would become, but I knew it had shifted something. Whether for better or worse, I couldn't say. We didn't talk much over breakfast. But I caught him glancing at me more than once. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me feel aware. My skin, my breath, the line of my collarbone beneath the robe, I felt all of it. I was no longer invisible. And that realization did something to me. By midday, I had distracted myself with chores. Folding laundry, cleaning out a cupboard that hadn't been touched in years. I needed movement. Stillness felt dangerous now, like I might fall back into the memory of his lips touching mine, and the way neither of us spoke afterward. Later in the afternoon, I found myself standing at the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection longer than usual. I hadn't worn makeup in days. I hadn't cared. But today I traced my eyes with a light brown pencil, added a touch of color to my lips. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to feel like I was claiming something back, some version of myself that had been boxed away. He knocked on the bathroom door lightly. "I'm heading out for a walk," he said. "Do you need anything?" I opened the door before I could overthink it. He looked surprised for a moment. I didn't say anything, just shook my head, and he nodded. "Back soon," he added. I watched him walk away from the window, down the street. His gait was steady, calm. I wondered what he thought of last night. Whether he regretted it. Whether he thought I did. When he returned, I was in the kitchen again, preparing something small for dinner. I didn't look up when he came in, but I could feel him pause in the doorway. It was like his presence filled every corner of the space, though he never crossed the line of propriety. That evening, my husband called. His voice was tired, distracted. "Flight's been changed," he said. "Looks like I'll be back late tomorrow." "Okay," I answered. I didn't ask why. He didn't offer. The call ended in under 30 seconds. I placed the phone face down on the table and exhaled. Later, as the light faded, I stepped out onto the back patio with a book I didn't intend to read. He was already there, sitting on the bench near the tree, sipping something warm. I hesitated, then joined him. We didn't speak right away. The air between us had changed again, less tension, more awareness. Like we had crossed a threshold but hadn't yet decided which direction we were facing. "I used to sit out here with her," he said quietly after a long pause. "She loved this time of day." I nodded. "It's the only time the house feels honest." He looked at me then, his eyes holding something that resembled both grief and clarity. "You look different today." I smiled faintly. Maybe I remembered who I was. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached down to pick a fallen leaf from the bench between us, his fingers brushing mine in the process. The contact was brief. Gentle. But I felt it like a tremor. "I don't want to make anything harder for you," he said. "You're not," I replied, almost too quickly. We sat in silence again, both knowing this wasn't sustainable. Something had been set in motion. Something neither of us had fully prepared for. As the stars began to appear, one by one, in the navy sky above us, I found myself wishing the night wouldn't end. Not because I wanted anything more to happen. But because for the first time in years, I felt seen. Not by a stranger. Not by a man with expectations or demands. But by someone who understood what it meant to be alone while surrounded by people. When I finally stood to go inside, he didn't follow. But I turned just once before opening the door, and in that moment, we looked at each other, not with apology, not with fear, but with the simple, complicated knowledge that something had begun. What it would become, we still didn't know. But the quiet between us was no longer empty. It was charged. Waiting. And I wasn't sure anymore whether I wanted to stop it. The following morning unfolded with a strange blend of calm and unease. I moved through the kitchen mechanically, pouring water into the kettle, slicing fruit, arranging toast on a plate, not because I was hungry, but because routine still gave me something to hold on to. Something predictable. Something I could control. He entered the kitchen a few minutes later. His movements were quiet, deliberate. He didn't look at me at first, just walked to the sink and rinsed an apple. But I could feel him watching me from the corner of his eye. There was something in the air between us, something suspended and unspoken. I found myself hyper-aware of everything, the soft rustle of his sleeves, the gentle scrape of the chair as he sat down across from me, the way his fingers moved slowly around the coffee mug. We didn't say much, but every silence felt loaded, like we were speaking entire volumes without sound. After breakfast, I retreated into the laundry room and began folding clothes, needing the distraction of movement. I sorted my husband's shirts without emotion, stacking them in neat piles, trying to ignore the growing weight in my chest. Every moment spent with his father seemed to push the edges of something forbidden further outward. It was a slow pressure, quiet but unmistakable. He passed by the laundry room doorway later that morning and paused briefly, watching me. I didn't stop folding. But I felt the air shift again. "You've always been kind," he said quietly. I didn't respond. I didn't know how. I kept folding. My fingers trembled slightly, but I kept moving. "I just wanted to say that," he added. "That I notice it." Then he was gone. His footsteps faded down the hall. I stood there for a long moment, holding a pair of socks in my hand, staring at the wall, trying to ground myself. But the floor beneath me didn't feel quite stable anymore. By afternoon, the house felt too small. I needed air. I told him I was going to run a few errands. He offered to come with me, casually, like it was nothing. And I said yes, almost before thinking. We drove mostly in silence. The roads were familiar, the shops unchanged, but everything inside me felt different. Every glance we exchanged carried the weight of what had happened, and what hadn't yet happened but threatened to. I parked near the corner market and stepped out, glad for the excuse to breathe on my own. Inside, we moved through the aisles without conversation. I picked up a few vegetables, some milk, tea, bread. He carried the basket. At one point, our fingers brushed when he handed me a jar. It lasted only a second. But it was enough. On the way home, he turned to look out the window while I drove. I glanced at him at a red light. He wasn't looking at me, but something in his expression, soft, troubled, thoughtful, stayed with me long after we pulled into the driveway. When we got home, I set the bags on the kitchen counter and started unpacking them. He stood near the sink, watching me in silence again. I wanted to ask him what he was thinking. I wanted to know if he felt what I felt, this quiet build of energy, this dangerous thread tying us closer with each passing day. Instead, I said nothing. I handed him a box of tea. He placed it in the cabinet without a word. And we both pretended nothing had shifted. That night, I stayed up later than usual. My husband hadn't called. The house was quiet. I wandered into the living room and sat on the edge of the sofa, not sure what I was doing there. Just needing to feel somewhere else. He came in quietly, holding a folded blanket. "You left this on the porch earlier," he said, placing it on the armrest beside me. I nodded, watching his hand as he gently smoothed the fabric. He didn't move away right away. He stood there for a second too long. Then he said, "You shouldn't feel invisible." The words hit me harder than I expected. I swallowed, staring at my hands in my lap. I wanted to respond, to agree, to say something meaningful. But all I could do was nod again. He left the room without another word. I sat there for a long time after, heart heavy, breath shallow, trying to understand what I was becoming. This wasn't a story of passion or betrayal or romance. This was something smaller, more dangerous, loneliness making space where it shouldn't. A hunger not for affection, but for recognition. The next day, I found myself dressing differently. Nothing overt, nothing obvious. But I chose a sweater that fit closer to my shape. I wore earrings I hadn't touched in months. I brushed my hair and let it fall naturally around my shoulders. I didn't do it for anyone, I told myself. I just wanted to feel like myself again. He noticed. I saw it in his eyes at breakfast. He didn't comment, but the silence between us stretched tighter than usual. My husband called later that morning. The conversation was short. A change in schedule. He'd be home the day after next, not tomorrow. I said okay. He hung up before I could ask how he was. After the call, I stood in the hallway staring at the family photos. Our son at 6, missing teeth. Our wedding picture. A Christmas years ago. They all looked like a different life. Like borrowed moments from someone else's memory. I turned and found him standing there again. He didn't speak, just followed my gaze to the photos. You were beautiful then, he said quietly. You still are. I didn't thank him. I couldn't. The words felt dangerous, like sparks near dry leaves. I nodded and turned away, retreating to the kitchen. That night, I heard him moving in the living room. I hesitated in the hallway, then walked in slowly. He was reading by the lamp, glasses low on his nose. He looked up, surprised but not startled. I sat across from him. The quiet filled the space like water, steady and rising. We can't pretend this isn't happening, I said finally. He closed the book gently, setting it aside. I know, he replied. That was all we said. But it was enough to confirm that we were both aware of the line in the sand. And how dangerously close we stood to it now. The air in the house began to feel different. Not heavier, just more alert, like the walls were listening, like even the furniture could sense something had shifted. I found myself moving quieter through the rooms, not out of guilt, but out of awareness. The energy between us had changed, and the space we shared was charged with that invisible tension, like static before a storm. I didn't avoid him, but I stopped lingering. Our conversations grew shorter, tighter, more carefully measured. The casual comfort we had once found in one another's presence was now loaded with implication. A glance across the kitchen carried weight. A touch on the back of a hand could linger too long without intention. And yet, nothing more happened. No new lines were crossed. We floated in that dangerous in-between, a place where decisions weren't yet made, but temptation hovered constantly at the edge of every moment. One morning, while folding laundry in the guest room, I found an old photo album buried under a pile of winter scarves. I hadn't seen it in years. Its cover was frayed at the edges, the pages stiff from time. I sat on the bed and opened it slowly. There we were. My husband and I, younger, smiling in ways that didn't feel familiar anymore. Trips to the coast. Our son's second birthday. A random Sunday brunch with friends. His mother was there, too, vibrant and laughing in a way I remembered vividly. It all felt like it belonged to someone else. He passed by the door and noticed me. He didn't come in. He just watched from the hall, his gaze softening when he saw what I was looking at. She loved that beach, he said. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Everything feels so far away, I finally murmured. He didn't answer. Just gave a faint nod and disappeared down the hall. Later that day, I was in the backyard pulling weeds, hands deep in the soil, trying to quiet my thoughts through something tangible. The late afternoon sun cast a gentle warmth across the garden, and I focused on the rhythmic motion of pulling, sorting, discarding. He appeared beside me with 2 glasses of water, setting one on the edge of the porch without a word. We worked in silence for a while, the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just full. Eventually, I sat back on my heels and took the glass, nodding my thanks. He sat across from me on the porch step, wiping sweat from his brow with a folded handkerchief. "There's something peaceful about doing this," he said. "The simplicity of it." I agreed. "It's honest work. You see results. Unlike some things," he added, and I looked at him then, really looked. His eyes weren't questioning or pleading. Just present. And in that moment, I realized how much I missed being seen. Not analyzed, not desired, just noticed. Truly noticed. That evening, a friend I hadn't spoken to in months called out of the blue. We chatted briefly, surface-level pleasantries, questions about family, vague reassurances. She said, "You sound different. Lighter. Are you seeing someone?" I laughed reflexively. No. Of course not. But I felt the lie echo inside me even after we hung up. I stood by the window for a long time after the call ended, watching the last sliver of sunlight sink below the fence line. The house behind me was quiet, the kind of quiet that waits. Later, I found him in the kitchen, standing by the open fridge. He looked over his shoulder and gave a small smile, as though he'd been caught stealing something. I smiled back before I could stop myself. "Anything left of that tart from yesterday?" I asked, stepping closer. He moved aside, gesturing toward the plate. "Only if we share." We stood at the counter, eating straight from the dish in small, quiet bites. It felt strangely intimate, two people bound not by romance, not even by secrecy, but by the simple act of being in each other's company when no one else noticed. Afterward, I started to leave the room, but he reached out, just gently, fingertips grazing my wrist. I turned to face him. "Whatever this is," he said, "I know we didn't plan it. I don't want to make it harder." His voice was steady, but low, like he was choosing every word with care. "I know," I said, my voice barely audible. He let go. The touch lasted only seconds, but the feeling lingered much longer. The next day, my husband called again. He was speaking faster than usual, distracted, his tone clipped. "I'll be back Monday instead of Sunday," he said. "Something's come up." I didn't ask what. I simply said, "All right." After the call, I went for a walk around the block. The air outside was cooler than expected, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. Leaves crunched beneath my shoes, and for a brief moment, I wished I could walk forever, away from the weight of decisions, away from what I knew was slowly forming inside me. When I returned, he was in the living room, flipping through the newspaper. He looked up and smiled when I came in. I paused, then walked over and sat down across from him, folding my hands in my lap. "This can't go on like this," I said, not unkindly. He nodded, as if he had been preparing for that moment too. "I know." We didn't say more. We didn't need to. Everything had already been said, even in silence. But in that shared moment of understanding, I felt both relief and sorrow. We had acknowledged it. Whatever it was. And now, whatever came next would be a choice, not an accident, not a misunderstanding. Just a choice. One that neither of us could unmake once it was done. The days following that moment were strange, full of unspoken understanding and a quiet tension that simmered beneath the surface. I caught myself thinking more about my actions, the words I used, the way I moved through the house. It was as if everything was being watched, not by anyone else, but by myself. I could feel the weight of my own choices more acutely now, and with each passing day, the distance between my husband and me seemed to widen even further. I spent most of my time at home alone, tidying, organizing, trying to create some semblance of control. But there was no peace to be found in it, no satisfaction. I kept glancing at the phone, wondering if I should call him, wondering if he would call me. But I knew the answer. We were waiting for something to shift, waiting for a signal that would make it all feel less inevitable. He was still here, in the house, but in a way, he was already gone. I tried to remember the last time I felt anything close to alive in this place. It wasn't with my husband, that much was clear. It was with him, his father. The quiet moments, the gentle conversations, the small gestures that felt more real than anything I had felt in years. I found myself thinking of him more often, even in the mundane moments of the day. When I went out for groceries, I caught myself wondering what he was doing at home, what he was thinking, if he, too, was waiting for something to change. One afternoon, I was sitting by the window, sipping tea, when I saw him outside, standing near the old oak tree. He wasn't doing anything special, just looking at the sky. But the sight of him, so still and yet so present, stirred something deep inside me. I found myself standing up, walking toward the door, not knowing why, but feeling an almost magnetic pull toward him. I stepped outside, the cool air brushing my face, and walked across the yard toward him. He didn't hear me approach, and for a moment, I just stood there, watching him, feeling the distance between us, the years that had passed, and yet the strange familiarity of his presence. Finally, he turned, his eyes meeting mine. He didn't speak right away, but his expression softened, as if he had been expecting me, as if we both knew what had been left unsaid. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded, even though I wasn't entirely sure I was. "I don't know," I said. "I think I'm just trying to figure things out." He didn't push. He just stood there, letting the silence stretch between us, until it became comfortable in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. "I've been thinking about a lot of things," I added after a while. "About us. About everything." His gaze never wavered. "I think about it, too," he said, his voice low, almost as if he was afraid to say it too loudly. I took a deep breath. "What do we do now?" He stepped closer, but not enough to close the space entirely. There was still a distance, a line we both knew we couldn't cross. But the pull was undeniable, and it was getting harder to ignore. "I don't know," he replied, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "But we're here, aren't we?" I nodded, feeling the weight of his words more than I wanted to. There was no easy answer. No quick fix. But there was a kind of understanding between us now, one that hadn't been there before. It was fragile, but it was real. As the days wore on, the house felt more and more like a waiting room. Waiting for my husband to come home, waiting for some sign that things would return to normal, even though I knew deep down that they wouldn't. The quiet moments with him, his father, grew more frequent, and with each conversation, the line between us seemed to blur just a little more. He was always there, just a step away, and I couldn't seem to escape the way my body responded to his presence. It was subtle, like the brush of a hand against mine, the way his eyes lingered on me just a little too long. There was no malice, no hidden agenda, just a shared understanding of something unspoken. I wanted to tell myself that I was in control of the situation, that I could handle it, that I could keep my distance and keep my emotions in check. But the truth was, I was losing control, and the more I tried to hold on to my old life, the more it slipped through my fingers. The day my husband returned, the air in the house seemed to change again. It wasn't just his presence, it was the way everything felt different now. He didn't know what had happened. He didn't know what was brewing beneath the surface. But I could feel it. I could feel the divide, the slow burn of something irreversible. I made dinner that night, like I always did. The same dishes, the same routine. But everything felt off, like I was acting out a script that no longer made sense. My husband sat at the table, eating in silence, while I tried to focus on the task at hand. But my mind kept drifting back to him, his father. The way he looked at me. The way I looked at him. After dinner, we sat together on the couch, the quiet pressing in around us. I couldn't bring myself to look at him. It felt too raw, too exposed. Finally, he spoke. "How was your day?" he asked, his voice soft, but I could tell there was something underneath the casual tone. I glanced up at him, meeting his eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. "It was fine," I said, but the words felt hollow. He didn't press further, but I could see it in his face. He could feel the distance, too. He just didn't know why it was there. And neither did I. The next few days passed in a blur. I went through the motions, but everything felt strained, like a song played out of tune. My husband and I barely spoke. The house felt colder, the silence heavier. But there was no way to go back. Whatever had started between me and his father was there, lingering in the corners of every room, in every look we shared. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know where it was going, or if it would even last. But I knew one thing for sure, things would never be the same again. The days blurred together, a series of quiet interactions that barely registered in my mind. My husband was home again, but it felt like he wasn't. There were moments when he would walk past me, his steps light on the wooden floor, and I would almost forget he was there. He spoke in a detached tone, and I replied in kind. We were together, but not. It was a strange limbo, suspended between two lives I could no longer reconcile. Each time I crossed paths with him, his father, the air between us grew thicker, heavier with an unspoken understanding. There were subtle moments, his touch as he passed me in the hallway, the way our eyes met when he handed me something across the kitchen table, or the fleeting glances when I wasn't looking. It wasn't overt. It didn't need to be. Everything we felt hung between us in the spaces where words no longer reached. My mind raced, but my body stayed still. I couldn't move past what was happening. I couldn't ignore the way I was drawn to him, the way he seemed to see through the walls I had built up over the years. He wasn't like my husband, distant and closed off. He wasn't like the others in my life, constantly taking and never giving. He simply noticed me. And in that noticing, I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. But the consequences of that attention were never far from my mind. Each look we exchanged, each unspoken word, added weight to the secret I could no longer ignore. It wasn't about desire, not in the way that term is usually understood. It was about something much deeper, the recognition of a need I hadn't known existed, the slow realization that I had been starving for something I had been too afraid to ask for. The house, once a place of comfort and routine, had become a pressure cooker. I could feel it in the way we moved through our days, never speaking the truth, never acknowledging the rift that had started to form between us all. My husband was too busy to notice. Or maybe he didn't want to. Perhaps he had his own distractions, his own world to occupy. And for all his faults, for all the ways he had failed me, I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. He didn't deserve this. Neither did I, for that matter. But life doesn't play fair. One evening, after dinner, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, staring at the faint shadows cast by the fireplace. The light was low, and the room felt smaller than usual. The house had always felt large, especially with my husband away so often. But tonight, it felt like it was closing in around me. I heard footsteps, and he appeared in the doorway. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at me. It was the same way he had looked at me in the garden, in the kitchen, in the quiet spaces between words. There was no rush, no pressure. Just the weight of shared understanding. You look like you're a million miles away, he said finally, his voice soft. I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to. The truth was, I didn't know where I was anymore. Physically, I was right here in this house, with him, with my husband. But mentally, emotionally, I had already left. Or maybe I was just waiting. Waiting for the moment when the decision would no longer be mine to make. I don't know what I'm doing, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. The space between us had become a kind of conversation in itself. You don't have to, he said after a moment. I don't think anyone does, really. I shook my head, frustration rising in my chest. I can't keep pretending that things are fine. That nothing has changed. He stepped into the room then, sitting across from me on the armchair. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something deep and unknown. A place I had never thought I would be, yet somehow knew I had always been headed toward. What do we do now? I asked, my voice thick with the weight of everything unsaid. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, but there was something there, something that felt like understanding. We keep going. One step at a time. One day at a time. I nodded slowly, though the words didn't bring me any comfort. One day at a time. That was what we had been doing. But I knew that it wouldn't be enough. Not anymore. The next few days passed in a haze. My husband remained distant, focused on his work and the routine that had become his life. I couldn't blame him for it, not entirely. We had both built walls, and now they were suffocating us. We were in this house, living a life that neither of us truly wanted anymore, but neither of us knew how to walk away from it. One evening, I was reading in the study, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the pages in front of me, when I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I didn't look up immediately, but I knew who it was. I always did now. He appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. His gaze rested on me for a moment before he spoke. Do you ever wonder how we got here? I put the book down, folding my hands in my lap. I think about it all the time. He smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. It's strange, isn't it? How everything changes so slowly, and then one day, you wake up and realize that everything is different. It's like waking up from a dream, I said quietly, the words coming unbidden. But the dream is real. His gaze softened, and for a moment, it was as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He didn't speak for a long time. Neither of us did. We just sat there, the silence stretching between us, heavy and full of meaning. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know where this path was leading us. But I knew that it wasn't something I could walk away from. Not anymore. Whatever was happening, whatever was beginning to unfold between us, was no longer something I could control. But I also knew that it wasn't over. Not yet. And in that moment, I understood the truth, whatever came next, it was going to change everything. The house felt different now, and I couldn't quite figure out if it was the stillness that had settled into every corner or the weight of our unspoken truth. The air between us, my husband and me, had become something more suffocating than silent neglect. It was the absence of something vital, something we had both let slip away over time. But even with the distance between us, there was an undeniable presence in the house that I couldn't ignore, nor could I escape it. The tension, the quiet understanding between his father and me, was now a part of every interaction. The days were routine, yet they felt out of place. I found myself stuck in a loop of constant reflection, replaying moments, words, glances that had passed between us. It was like I was waiting for something to give, for some kind of release. And yet, the house remained silent, still, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. It wasn't until the evening of the 6th day that I realized how much I had been holding on to the idea of change. I had thought that by continuing with my daily life, by pretending that things were normal, I could stop the wave of emotion building inside me. But the truth was, it wasn't normal anymore. The person I had been, the wife, the mother, the woman who existed before all of this, no longer felt like she belonged here. I was standing in the kitchen that evening, preparing dinner alone, when I felt his presence before I saw him. He walked in without a sound, his footsteps muffled by the carpet, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. But then he spoke, his voice low and careful, as if testing the air between us. "I don't think we can keep pretending like everything's fine," he said, his gaze focused on the counter where I was chopping vegetables. His words hit me harder than I expected, though I had known for days that we couldn't continue living in this half-state, neither of us acknowledging what was happening. I stopped chopping and looked up at him. His expression was neutral, almost distant, but his eyes, those dark eyes that had seen everything between us, betrayed him. I saw the uncertainty there, the fear of what admitting the truth would mean. "I know," I replied softly. My voice felt like a thread in the air, barely there but still holding everything together. He stepped closer, but not too close. There was still an invisible line between us that neither of us had dared to cross. But with every passing second, I could feel that line becoming thinner, more fragile. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his words quieter now, but still carrying the weight of everything that had been left unspoken. "You won't," I answered without hesitation. I didn't even think about it before the words left my mouth. But when I said them, I realized how much I needed to believe them. I had convinced myself that I was in control, that I could manage this growing connection between us. But now, standing in the kitchen, the truth was undeniable. I wasn't in control. And neither was he. I set the knife down on the counter, feeling the tension in my chest tighten as I met his gaze. His face softened, the hardness that had been there just a moment before giving way to something I couldn't name. It was the first time in days that I felt like we were truly seeing each other. "We need to talk about this," he said, his voice a little firmer now. He wasn't asking, he was stating it as fact. And for the first time in weeks, I realized that talking about it was the only way out of this suffocating silence. "I know," I repeated, my breath catching slightly as I felt a strange rush of both relief and dread. "But, can we do it later? I need time to think." He nodded, stepping back slightly, giving me the space I hadn't realized I needed. We stood there for a moment, not saying anything more, just feeling the weight of the situation pressed down on us both. After he left the kitchen, I felt a strange emptiness, like a door had been opened but no one had stepped through yet. I continued making dinner, but my mind was elsewhere. How had we come to this point? How had everything that seemed so distant and impossible become so real? Later, as I ate alone in the dimly lit dining room, I tried to focus on the food in front of me. It felt wrong to eat, as if every bite was a reminder that life still continued on, even as everything else around me fell apart. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending that I wasn't waiting for something to break. The house felt colder as the evening wore on, the stillness becoming more oppressive. It was then that I realized I had been waiting for him. His father. It wasn't just his presence that filled the room, it was the weight of the connection that neither of us could escape. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing faster than I could understand. The decision to confront it, to face the truth, felt inevitable, but also frightening. How would my husband react? How would I react? I closed my eyes, trying to will myself to sleep, but I couldn't. My thoughts raced with images of the days ahead, of what would come if we acknowledged what had happened. It was a strange kind of anxiety, half dread, half anticipation. And then there was the unspoken understanding between us. There was no turning back from what had already happened. I knew that much. But the question remained, what would happen now? The following day, when I saw him again, I knew that it was time. We could no longer avoid the conversation we had both been putting off, hoping that time would resolve everything. The tension in the house had become unbearable, and the weight of the truth was a burden neither of us could carry alone anymore. He was in the living room, sitting by the window, looking out at the darkening sky. The silence between us was as thick as the night air, and I hesitated before walking toward him. But I knew there was no point in waiting anymore. I sat beside him, our shoulders nearly touching. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't need to. The air between us spoke volumes, and I could feel the tension building again, as if it were a thread ready to snap. Finally, I took a deep breath and said what we had both been avoiding. "We need to talk." He turned his head slightly, meeting my gaze, and nodded. "I know," he said quietly. And in that moment, I understood. Whatever happened next would change everything. The air in the house became heavier with each passing day, and I couldn't help but feel it in my bones. It wasn't the usual kind of tension, one born from disagreements or stress. No, this was something different. Something that had grown quietly, steadily, until it enveloped everything. It lingered in the corners of every room, in the spaces between words, in the glances that never quite met. It was the unspoken understanding between us, his father and me, that created this atmosphere. Every glance, every brush of skin, every word spoken without saying anything at all, carried the weight of 1,000 unasked questions. And while my husband remained oblivious, lost in his own world, I couldn't help but feel like a prisoner in my own life. The days passed in a haze. I went through the motions, doing what I had always done, preparing meals, cleaning, making sure everything was in place. But I could feel the cracks forming beneath the surface. I could feel the distance growing, not just between my husband and me, but between me and myself. Who was I becoming? What had I turned into? It wasn't that I hated my life. Far from it. But I had begun to realize that it wasn't enough anymore. The life I had once found comfort in had become suffocating. And the life I was starting to feel drawn to, the one I could almost taste, almost touch, was the one that terrified me. It was one of those moments, those rare, fleeting instances, when everything became too much, when everything inside me reached a breaking point. It happened after dinner, when the dishes were done, when the house was still and quiet, when the weight of the day hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. I had been sitting in the living room, staring at the fireplace, lost in thought, when I heard the door open. My husband had returned from yet another late-night meeting, and though he had been in and out for the past few days, this time was different. This time, I felt it, the shift. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood in the doorway, watching me. I could see the weariness in his eyes, the exhaustion from days of travel, of business, of everything that had been consuming him. He had become a stranger to me in some ways, though I wasn't sure how much of that was his fault and how much was mine. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice soft. "How's it going?" I didn't answer right away. I didn't know how to. What could I say? What was there to say when everything felt so empty? "I'm fine," I replied after a pause, my voice sounding like a lie even to my own ears. He didn't respond to that. He just stepped further into the room, closing the door softly behind him. For a moment, he stood there, looking at me. His eyes were distant, as if he was seeing me but not really seeing me at all. I wanted to say something, wanted to explain everything, but I didn't know where to begin. I didn't know how to start unraveling this mess I had found myself in. How could I tell him that the person standing before him wasn't the person he thought she was? How could I tell him that everything had changed, that the world around us had shifted, and there was no going back? He sat down beside me on the couch, but there was no comfort in the gesture. We were too far apart, too removed from each other. I could feel his presence beside me, but it felt like we were oceans apart. "I don't know what's been going on with us," he said after a long pause. His voice sounded tired, defeated. "It's like we're just existing. Not really living." I felt the sting of those words more than I should have. I knew they were true. But I couldn't bring myself to acknowledge them. Not yet. We'll figure it out, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't believe it, not really. But I said it anyway. It felt like the right thing to say. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the weight of everything between us too much to bear. I could feel the storm inside me building, could feel the pressure of everything I had been holding in. And then, just as I thought I might lose myself in the silence, I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I didn't need to look to know who it was. I knew it before I even turned my head. His father. He stopped just outside the living room door, his presence felt before it was seen. There was no need for words. We had all been dancing around the truth for too long, pretending that everything was fine, that nothing had changed. But now, there was no denying it. I looked at my husband, and then at his father, standing there in the doorway, and something inside me snapped. The weight of the past few days, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid, crashed down on me. I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep hiding. I think it's time we talked, I said, my voice steady but filled with an emotion I couldn't name. The words felt like a release, like something had been unlocked inside me. The truth was out there now, hanging in the air between us, and there was no going back. He didn't respond immediately, but I saw the recognition in his eyes. He knew. He had known for a while. And I had known, too. This moment, this conversation, was inevitable. His father stepped into the room, his gaze flicking from me to my husband and back again. There was no judgment in his eyes, no anger. Just understanding. It was as if he had already accepted that this was where we were, that this was the path we were on, whether we liked it or not. My husband looked between us, his face slowly falling as the realization hit him. The room felt colder now, the air heavier, and the weight of the truth that had been simmering between us for so long finally came crashing down. I don't know what to say, he muttered, his voice cracking. I don't know what to do. I didn't have an answer for him. I didn't know what to do either. But I knew that we had reached a point where the truth could no longer be ignored. We'll figure it out, I said again, but this time, it wasn't a lie. It was the beginning of something new. A new chapter, whether we were ready for it or not. And as I looked at the two of them, my husband and his father, standing in front of me, I realized that the real question wasn't what we would do next, it was what we had been hiding from all this time. The truth had come out. And now, we had to face it. Together. It didn't happen with a scream. There was no dramatic scene, no broken plates or shouted accusations. Just a silence so thick it seemed to crawl along the walls of the living room, swallowing the light and sound until all that remained was breath and guilt. I remember the moment my husband's eyes met mine and the flicker of something I had never seen before, betrayal mixed with disbelief, a wound opening without even being touched. He didn't ask the obvious question. He didn't need to. The truth had already unfolded in the quiet between us. He looked at me, then at his father, and something inside him seemed to collapse, not loudly, but with the devastating weight of understanding. I tried to speak. I wanted to explain, to offer something, clarity, maybe, or at least some fragment of the truth that might soften the blow. But my mouth refused to move. Nothing would come. Not excuses. Not apologies. Just silence. My husband stood motionless for several seconds, his face unreadable. And then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room. I heard his footsteps retreat down the hallway, slow and heavy, as if he was dragging the entire weight of our marriage with him. The front door didn't slam. It closed gently, painfully so. And then he was gone. I stood there, still beside his father, feeling my heartbeat in my throat. The room felt too bright suddenly, the lamps casting long shadows that danced on the floor. Everything was quiet, except for the ticking of the wall clock, marking every second that passed without him. I didn't move. I didn't cry. I just stood there, stunned into stillness, unsure of what came next. I had imagined this moment 100 times in my mind, what he might say, how I would react, whether I would feel regret or relief. But none of those imagined scenarios came close to the reality of that silence, that void where love used to live. His father stood beside me, his arms at his sides, unmoving. He didn't speak either. I don't think he could. There was a heaviness in his expression I couldn't read, something that looked like guilt but carried more age, more weight. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. Not now. Instead, I walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table. My legs were trembling, and my hands felt cold. I pressed my palms flat against the wood, grounding myself in its smooth surface, reminding myself I was still here, still in this house that was no longer a home. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Time became shapeless, meaningless. Eventually, I heard footsteps again. Softer this time. When I looked up, it was him, his father, standing at the threshold between the hallway and the kitchen. He looked like he wanted to speak, to offer something, but I raised a hand slightly, asking him not to. Not now. He nodded and turned away. I spent the night alone in the guest room. I couldn't bear to lie in our bed, couldn't face the memories stitched into those sheets. The room was cold, sterile, and that felt appropriate. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how one moment, one quiet, stolen moment, could unravel decades. I wondered where he had gone. Whether he would come back. Whether this was the beginning of the end or the end of everything. But mostly, I thought about what I had become. About how far I had drifted from the person I used to be, the woman who had once believed in loyalty, in commitment, in love that endured. When morning came, I moved through the house like a ghost. I made coffee I didn't drink. I folded a blanket that didn't need folding. I opened the windows to let in air that didn't soothe me. The hours crawled. In the afternoon, I heard the door again. My breath caught, heart pounding, and for a moment I thought, hoped, it might be him. My husband. That he had returned, ready to talk, ready to fight, ready for something. But it wasn't him. It was our son. He hadn't told me he was coming. He hadn't needed to. Something in him must have known, maybe in a dream, maybe in a silence on the phone with his father. Maybe someone had said something. Or maybe this kind of destruction always sends out signals only children can feel. He stood in the doorway, suitcase in hand, confusion etched across his face as he looked between me and the emptiness of the house. "Where's Dad?" he asked. I froze. I hadn't prepared for this. I hadn't even thought that soon someone else would have to bear the weight of what we'd done. I opened my mouth, but again, no words came. "Is everything okay?" he asked, stepping inside. I nodded, but it was a lie. I knew he could see that. The way he looked at me, concerned, searching, it was the kind of look I had seen in his eyes when he was a boy, when he knew something wasn't right but didn't know how to ask. He set his suitcase down. "What happened?" I sat at the kitchen table, my hands in my lap, and finally, after all the silence, after all the hiding, I told the truth. Not all of it. Not in detail. But enough. His expression didn't change right away. He sat down across from me, listening without interruption, his face unreadable. When I finished, the silence that followed felt like judgment, but it wasn't. It was just heartbreak. I saw it in his eyes. The realization. The disappointment. The pain. "I need to go for a walk," he said quietly, standing up. I didn't stop him. I let him go. And when the door closed behind him, I knew the damage had extended beyond the marriage. The cracks had reached our son, too. I was alone again. And this time, it felt final. The days after he left were the hardest, not because of the absence of my husband, but because of the silence. The house was eerily still, and I could feel every second stretch longer than it should. Time felt like a rubber band pulled too tight, snapping back at me with each thought, each moment of realization. The sun came up each morning, the same as it always did, but I felt as though it had forgotten to shine into my life. The house that had once been a home, filled with memories of laughter and routine, now felt like an empty shell. I didn't know what I was waiting for anymore. I wasn't sure if I was waiting for him to come back or if I was waiting for some kind of revelation, something that would tell me what to do next. But every time I looked at the door, every time I heard a car drive by, I found myself hoping that he would come back, that we would talk, that maybe we could start over. But I knew deep down that this wasn't something we could just move past. It was too big. Too much had been said without words. Too many boundaries had been crossed. The damage had been done. It was the 4th day after he had left when I finally made a decision. I wasn't sure if it was the right one, but I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep waiting for something to fix itself. I had to face the reality of what had happened and what had been broken. I called him. I knew it was the right thing to do, even though a part of me feared what the conversation might bring. I had no idea how it would end, what we would say, or what would come next. But I had to do something. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before he picked up. I heard the familiar sound of his voice, but it was different, careful, tentative, almost as if he was afraid to speak. "Hello?" His voice was softer than I remembered, strained. "It's me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to talk." There was a pause on the other end, a long silence that stretched between us. "I know," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I could hear the weight of everything hanging in the air, the unspoken words, the emotions that had been left to fester. I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. "I don't know where to begin," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I don't know how to make sense of everything." He was silent for a moment, and I could tell he was struggling with the same uncertainty. "I don't know either," he admitted quietly. "But we can't keep avoiding it. We can't keep pretending like nothing's happened." His words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to tell him I was sorry. I wanted to say everything I hadn't been able to say before. But I didn't know where to begin. How could I explain something so complicated, something that had happened over time, in small moments that added up to this? "I think I've known for a while," I said softly, my voice barely audible. "I think I've known that something was broken, but I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to face it." There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear his breathing, steady and calm, but I knew that he was feeling the same weight of everything I was feeling. "I've known too," he said quietly. I didn't want to believe it. "I don't want to hurt you," I said, my voice cracking. "But I think I already have." "We've both hurt each other," he replied, his voice still gentle but filled with the sorrow of everything unspoken. "But I don't want to lose you." The words lingered between us, and for a moment, it felt like everything I had been holding inside, everything I had been avoiding, was finally being acknowledged. But even then, I knew it wasn't enough. We had to face the truth of what had happened, the choices we had made, and the consequences that would follow. "I don't know if we can fix this," I said softly, feeling the weight of the truth settle in my chest. "But I think we need to try." He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, and I could feel the uncertainty of what was to come. But in that moment, I knew we had reached a point where we couldn't turn back. We had to face it. We had to face everything. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said finally, his voice steady but filled with something I couldn't quite place. "We'll talk. We'll figure it out. I'll be here, I replied, the words feeling like a promise, even though I wasn't sure what I was promising. The call ended with no more words. Just the quiet click of the phone. The house felt different again. The silence was no longer oppressive, but pregnant with possibility. It wasn't peace. It wasn't resolution. But it was a start. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, unsure of what to do with myself. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching into the next, and I found myself pacing the rooms, unable to settle into anything. I had no idea what would happen when he came back. But I knew it couldn't go on like this. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of what had happened, pretending that everything was fine. We had to face it. We had to face each other. And when the door opened that evening, when I heard the familiar sound of his footsteps entering the house, I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel peace. I felt something else. Something heavier. Something that told me that we were at the crossroads now, and the decisions we made from here on out would change everything. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at me. Neither of us spoke at first. We didn't need to. Are we ready? I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, the answer unspoken but clear. We were both ready. Ready to face whatever came next, even if we didn't know what that was. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a small, fragile flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going. Enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could still find a way back to each other.